Okay, before we start our journey in PHP, we really have to understand just a very little bit about how the web works. And this will make some of the things that we do later on with the PHP a little bit more understandable. Okay, so in our very simplified model, there's really three entities that play a role. There's the user, the browser, and the web server. And so let's look and see how these things interact together. So first of all, the user enters a URL into the browser. We do this all the time. We type in google.com, or maybe sometimes we search for certain things and then we click a link. But when you click a link, the browser sets the URL based upon the link that you clicked. After this, the browser sends an HTTP request to the web server. Now let's just take a pause here and talk about HTTP for just a moment. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So it's a communication protocol that's used to talk to web servers. And as long as you are compliant with that protocol, you can communicate to the web server in any type of language that you want. But in this case, the browser, whatever language the browser was written in, it's sending an HTTP request over to the web server. Now, when it sends it, there's a packet of information going over there, and that includes things, for example, like the HTTP version that we're communicating with, the URL that was requested. There's HTTP request headers, and we'll take a look at some of those in a second. And there's optionally some HTTP body that was sent. So for example, when you submit a contact form, the information that you put in that form is sent over as part of the HTTP body usually. So at this point, the web server does its magic and it sends an HTTP response back to the browser. Now again, HTTP has a protocol, and part of that protocol defines the structure that's coming back for us. So in that structure that's coming back, there's response codes. We know these. For example, someone might say that there's a 404 not found, or there might be response codes in the 500s. That means there was some error on the server. But typically, we'll get this 200 type of response code back, meaning that everything was okay. In addition to that response code, there's typically other response headers. And finally, there's the content that you requested. So then the browser takes this HTTP response and it renders that response to the user. And we'll take a look at an example here in a second. But I want to focus in on more about what the web server does. Where is PHP in all of this? Okay, so this is usually where PHP gets involved. So the web server does a lot of processing of the request to convert it to a response. So usually there's two different types of content. There's static content, as an example of that is like a photo. So a photo is just a file that's sitting on a disk somewhere. It may not be exactly on the web server. Maybe it's in Amazon S3 storage or wherever it's at. But that type of content, static content that doesn't really change, can usually be served up directly by the web server itself. And the second type of content is dynamic content. And what we mean by dynamic content is content that is going to be changing. So for example, I'm logged in to a service, say, and I see a dashboard that's specific to me. And when you log in, you see a dashboard that's specific to you. Now, how that happens is there's not two different static pages for us, all right, but that content is using a template and it's dynamically generated. So typically a language such as PHP will query a database and grab some data. And then there's a template that the data is used to fill out, and it creates the content that we normally would see on our dashboard. But I want to be careful here. The response come from the web server is typically HTML, hypertext markup language, so the stuff that we usually see on the web in the browser, but it doesn't have to be. It can be anything from JSON, which is JavaScript object orientation, so it's like data. It could be a PDF file, it could be an image file, and all of those different responses, when they come back, the browser can handle it in multiple different ways. When it gets HTML, it renders it into the page that we can see. When it gets something like an image, that might be embedded in the page, or it might be something that you wanted to download. Same thing with a PDF. A PDF could be rendered in the page, or maybe it's something you wanted to download again. All right, let's take a look at a real request. So we're going to go to www.google.com. We've all been here before. It renders just like this. So I'm not logged in on this session. I'm in an incognito window. All right, but we can see how the browser renders out the Google page. I'm using Chrome here as my browser. Most browsers have a context window, so when you right click on it, you'll see some options here. One of the options is View Page Source. And so let's take a look at that for a second. What this is this is the response that came back from the web server. And you can see, for example, it has doc type as HTML. So it has HTML tags, has a header. I can scroll to the right here a little bit more, but we see mostly it's script. So all of this is mostly JavaScript. In fact, I would say 95% of this page is JavaScript. And somehow the browser turns all of this JavaScript into this HTML. Now, how that happens behind the scenes, that's part of the browser magic. We're not going to cover that for today, but I do want to look at one more context option, which is inspect. And we just saw, for example, that all of this is JavaScript, but when I use the inspect tab, I pull up the developer options for Chrome. You can see the HTML page has a lot of divs, has text area, but there's a lot of other content that's here. Now, how did this, which was mostly JavaScript, get turned into this, which is HTML? And that's part of what we're going to learn in this course. So I want to look at one more thing here, and we're going to take a look at the network tab here. I've cleared it out, and I'm going to refresh this page. A lot of different requests happen, and what we're going to see is every single one of these rows is a request. And I want to look at just the first one for now, and so we can start to see some of the information that we saw before. So here, for example, this is the initial request to www.google.com. And so over here on the right-hand side, then we can see some of that HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol content. So we're seeing response headers. Here is, for example, the response code, which is 200, which is status OK. But you can see all the different response headers down here. I'm going to go ahead and collapse these because it's just easier to talk, I think. But here's the initial request headers. You can see, for example, the request method, which is GET. You can see the request URL. And it has a lot of other information here for the server so it can process this request appropriately. It has, for example, my user agent. It can tell that I'm using Chrome as opposed to I'm on my iPhone. And then up here, we'll close the request header. As the second part, when the response came back, I get response headers. And the response header has what type of content it is replying with, which says text/HTML. So the browser then knows how to process this response. And if we look at the raw response, this is the raw response that we saw when we look at the view page source, but it's syntax highlighted here for us. And you can see it's a lot of JavaScript. But the browser takes this JavaScript and does the next steps. So some of the things the browser does after that initial response is it makes additional requests. And so, for example, you can see that it grabbed an image here. It's a PNG. And this PNG, if you look at the preview of it, that's the Google image. And in the browser, as it receives these responses for every single request, it starts to generate the DOM, which is this underlying HTML, which you can see here. It starts to generate those element by element. And it continues this generation until it ends up finally with the page that we see here. So that's a very simplified model of how the web works.